President Biden's racking up gas since announcing his re-election campaign.
God save the Queen, man.
Let's go.
Ban on transgender Americans. Has Vladimir Putin been weakened by recent events? It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq.
Don't go anywhere. It's a very exciting day around here.
Yeah, he went somewhere. So the liberal media thinks maybe it's time for a tune-up. A new Politico piece arguing why Democrats should primary Biden. Quote, President Joe Biden needs a primary opponent who can prepare him for the 2024 general election. Somebody who can make him prove that he can still run the traps and beat whichever Republican he faces. Biden already has Democrat challengers like RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson, but they've got some other names in mind, like Gavin Newsom, Beto O'Rourke, and Elizabeth Warren. As the piece puts it, quote, just as any heavyweight under the age of 75 with the pugilistic skills to put the current champion through a hammering 12 rounds. Tom, I know you're a big boxing fan. You know, you're big on that.
I'm a pugilist.
Tell me about this idea that maybe RFK Jr. isn't that person. Like, I don't understand that.
I mean, he is that person. They want to ignore him, though. They're pretending he's not a competitor. They're faking his numbers. I remember this last poll. They came out and he said he had 1.5% in New York. They fudged those numbers. He's got a lot of support out there, and he doesn't have just support on the left. He has a lot of freedom-loving people on the right who kind of like some of what he has to say as well. But I do think, I agree with this, the premise of the article, that it makes you stronger. I remember when I was a kid and Ted Kennedy ran against Jimmy Carter, and then Jimmy Carter defeated him, and then he becomes more powerful as a result. And then Ted Kennedy has to suck it up at the convention and say, I support the president. And so, you know, if you win and you win against a tough opponent, it's going to make you stronger. So in that way, I agree with that.
All right, let's go to number 2. They do get into some interesting conversation. Let's listen.
KellyAnn, we talk about polls. One of the things that always doesn't sit well with me is the Democrats love to point out that President Trump was basically, you know, there was no primary, no debates for him going into 2020. But what they always seem to overlook, and I've got one poll here I can quote that isn't quite a direct parallel, but President Trump never had under, I think, 94% approval rating from Republicans. President Biden struggles with that. 68% of registered voters have a major to moderate concern about Biden having the necessary mental and physical health to be president. So I don't think those are very easily compared.
That's even worse than an approval rating, because that is a direct indictment of his ability to do the job, to function mentally and physically. And that's a mainstream media poll that came from ABC last month. Joey, first of all, I don't think these are gaffes. I think this is Joe Biden. I think he mumbles, stumbles, and bumbles through the presidency. Everybody sees it.
Yeah.
And I think pieces like this, I would call them Operation Oust Kamala. I'd be very worried if I were her. Her approval ratings are at an all-time low. It is not racism and sexism. It is eyesight and hearing. We're paying attention to her. She inspires no confidence. She displays no competence. She doesn't seem to even want to do this job. She has shed over 23 or 25 senior staffers. Imagine that you're working for the first female vice president of color, and you don't want that job anymore. They basically all left, including if not especially the communications directors. But here's the problem with the whole premise. He's not going to get a primary competitor if he doesn't have primary debates. The head of the DNC, who's never really around, but he popped up to say, Jamie Harrison, to say there will be no debates. Competition in 2020 helped Joe Biden because he was way below in the pack. He didn't win Iowa, he didn't win New Hampshire. Competition would hurt him in 2024, but it's helping Trump. For all the talk about Trump is dead in the water after the midterms, he's not electable. The competition, the bigger the field, the more it helps Trump. The bigger the field, the more it hurts Biden.
Well,
now, that's KellyAnn Conway, and we already know her backstory, but that is actually a good point that she makes there. Symone Sanders Townsend, who filled in for Chris Hayes. I want to watch this because she does have a panel, and it's pretty funny. They briefly mention the fact that Joe Biden is not going to have a primary. He's the nominee, and that's it, and they just kind of move on.
Every campaign strategist nightmare. Joining us now are former Republican Congressman Carlos Corbello and Politico White House correspondent and playbook co-author Eugene Daniels. Carlos, let me start with you. How much do base Republican voters actually want their candidates to go after the LGBTQ community?
Look, Symone, there is a segment of the Republican primary electorate that finds this in some way attractive, can get behind this. It is a minority of the Republican electorate, but Ron DeSantis is clearly trying to do everything possible to catch up with Donald Trump. Now, at the end of the day, this is a fool's errand. Number one, it's wrong. It's very divisive. Donald Trump, for all of his flaws, I can tell you from personal conversations with him, doesn't have anything against the LGBT community, believes in equality. And for Ron DeSantis to attack him on this when there's so many issues to attack Donald Trump on is just a shame. Now, politically, the problem is that in a general election, swing voters in swing states and swing districts outright reject this kind of rhetoric, this kind of divisiveness, this kind of speech. So while Governor DeSantis might be trying to do himself a favor in this primary, trying to pick up some votes wherever he can, he's really setting himself up for failure if he actually gets past the primary.
You know, DeSantis is foray, if you will, wading into these divisive waters that he regularly swims in, if we're just going to be honest. It's like red meat for the 35%. Then you've got folks like former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and I think that he recently had one of the better Republican answers when it came to discussing the LGBTQ community. He framed decisions about trans health care for children as a parent's decision and not the government's. And I frankly think that he demonstrated you can give an answer that doesn't contain red meat. Can you survive a Republican primary that way, though, Carlos, in this particular climate?
These days, it really doesn't seem so, Symone. It's an experiment. Chris Christie's conducting it. He's not getting a whole lot of traction right now. But, again, for all of his flaws, you hear Donald Trump out there talking about abortion, for example, criticizing Ron DeSantis for the 6-week ban in the state of Florida. Even someone like Donald Trump, who has obviously adopted many extreme positions, understands what it takes to win and understands that you can't disqualify yourself entirely in a general election by taking these extremist positions, by saying things that swing voters in a lot of those districts that since the Republican trifecta of 2016 have gone Democrat. Well, that's going to continue as long as Republicans keep following this Ron DeSantis playbook. It isn't even the Donald Trump playbook anymore because Trump is rejecting some elements of it.
Donald Trump's playbook is so interesting and to me because on one hand, he's saying that about Ron DeSantis, and on the other, he's saying, I overturned Roe. It just makes no sense. So but that's the Republican primary. Eugene, there's not a Democratic primary because Joe Biden has decided to run for re-election, so he is the Democrats' nominee. Now, the White House, the president is running his campaign, and the White House has said that the president is going to continue to govern while he is doing this election situation. And I'm wondering about that strategy amidst what is a very tense political climate, and in a time where turnout is going to be the key when it does come to the general election.
Yeah, at the center of their message is that he is the person who put his hands on the wheel, and if you didn't like Donald Trump, he kind of eased things down a little bit in the country. That is at the center, and his governing, him being president, being in the White House, that's at the center of that. So that's part one. And so you've seen some of these events that they've done a little bit, but they've been mostly like policy events, right? They did the event about Roe v. Wade. They did an event around his economic message with a bunch of unions talking about that. That is what it's going to look like, I'm told, and that you're not going to see him out in the streets as much as maybe some folks would want him to. They often, we were talking right before we came on, they talk about how Barack Obama ran for re-election in 2012.
They say it'll look more like the Obama strategy.
Exactly, and these are two very different types of politicians. It is a very different time period in American politics, and Donald Trump was not running in 2012, right? Ron DeSantis was not running in 2012. And so you have Democrats a little nervous. They've been wanting to see him out there. They've been wanting him especially to see him more fundraising more, seeing Vice President Kamala Harris, the principals, Joe Biden and Doug Emhoff out there fundraising more. They've been doing more of that. I wouldn't expect a lot more to kind of satiate those people who are a little nervous until the end of this year, going into the beginning of next.
This is Ice Cube and Joe Rogan talking about RFK.
There, turn it around. You don't think
I don't
so?
put a lot on the president.
Not
I
this
don't put a
one.
lot on the president,
Well,
for sure.
I wonder what would happen if Robert Kennedy Jr. got in there. Very interested to see what happens with that guy.
Yeah, he seemed like a guy who at least is down to deep dive.
Yeah.
And talk real and really try to dissect what's really going on instead of just going with the herd, which would be easy for him to do, like go with the herd. By him going this route, it's like he's on a more noble route, and we just check him out and see how he navigates some of this stuff.
He's definitely on a more noble route, and it's definitely not something he planned to do initially. I mean, he was an environmental attorney.
Yeah.
He was the guy that cleaned up the Hudson River.
I spent my career working for a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen. And over the next couple of decades, we bought over 500 successful legal actions against Hudson River polluters.
He would go after these corporations that were dumping toxic waste. And that was his thing. It was like mercury in the water and trying to hold the corporations accountable. And then these women started showing up every time he would give these speeches, and they said, we want you to look into mercury in vaccines.
Yeah.
And so this is 18 years ago. And so for 18 years, this guy's been saying all this stuff about environmental concerns. And that was what his whole thing was. And then it wasn't until COVID came along. And then he wrote that book, The Real Anthony Fauci, detailing, what it is that these people are actually doing and how they are engineering these viruses. And they give grants, and it's dangerous gain of function research, and then they give you one medication that you have to take, and everybody gets on board with it, and they're making billions of dollars.
Yes.
And no one's talking about what he's saying, and he's saying it in a well-informed way, and he's expressing it to people like this is the playbook they always use, and they just used it on everybody.
Look, he's dealing with the same people we probably all are dealing with, and it's really time for us to really come up with a plan on how we're going to deal with this, because it's just going to continue to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not cool.
No, it's not. And I'm hoping people wake up enough to at least slow it down.
So I think, RFK put that out. He clipped it from the Joe Rogan show.